But
Yes.
let's move on to the next game, which I guess was Ratchet and Clank, right? A Rift Apart and Marvel Spider-Man 2. Are we going to lump those two together?
I have decided to lump those two together for the purposes of discussion
Okay.
here, because they do have a lot of similarities.
Okay.
So I actually looked at Spider-Man 2 first, and they showed me the performance mode, or at least the PS5 Pro equivalent. I think they might be calling it Performance Pro. That seems to be a common feature among Sony first-party developers, is to append Pro to their mode titles there. They compared it to the fidelity mode and the performance mode in the old PS5 code, and I think it's fairly comparable to the fidelity mode. I did some side-by-sides of the B-roll that we were provided just to illustrate here, and the PS5 Pro definitely looks a lot more detailed, a lot less aliased, and a lot more stable than the PS5 base footage in that performance mode. Compared to the fidelity mode, I think PSSR looks different here, but it's not necessarily worse. It's just a little different. Like, it's a little softer. The kinds of image detail that it struggles with is a little bit different. Maybe it has a little bit more breakup in the far distance, but in the kind of near field, it's holding up a little bit better there. I did do some pixel counts, and I was coming up with numbers at about 1152p pretty often on that PSSR view on the PlayStation 5 Pro, which is pretty similar to base PS5, but again, that's like not really giving you anything like the full picture here in terms of the actual image quality that's
No,
being
but it
delivered.
is interesting because, it is similar base resolutions.
Yes.
And obviously, PSSR will have a computational cost, but, it's not going to encompass, the full 45% of extra GPU power that's also part of it. So I'm kind of curious as to what's going on there and whether they may also have other modes as well. But it looks like just getting the performance RT modes that they typically do and rendering them at perceivably higher resolutions seems to be the primary focus.
Yeah. And I think one key thing here, because we did note it in our coverage from last week, is that we did see some maybe over sharpening in Ratchet and
Yeah.
in Spider-Man. And they mentioned that subsequent to that, they removed a sharpening step in their PSSR solution. So basically, before they had like a final sharpening pass to just bring out some of that local contrast, bring out some of that image detail, give you some of that edge enhancement, which is a very normal part of like these TAA style solutions, upsampling style
Yeah.
solutions. But with PSSR, they felt like that's not necessary, and actually they are resolving enough detail without it to not need it in their image resolve. So that actually is a pretty compelling vote of confidence in the technology, and it does make it look, I think, a lot more stable in motion than what we saw from the stuff last week. But yeah, in terms of those additional modes, the suggestion is definitely the performance mode is like the premier way to play the game. That's in common with a lot of the developers that I spoke to. They really do want you to emphasize those 60 FPS modes. But I was able to speak to Mike Fitzgerald, who is the core technology director at Insomniac, and he did hint at some possible improvements that may be coming to the fidelity mode as well.
We're totally thinking of some fun things we can do in a Fidelity Pro mode. The first thing we wanted to try and do really well was that Performance Pro, kind of unify the two modes that we have. We're going to make that the default on the PS5 Pro and treat it as the way we think players should play the most. But I think we have some ideas for a Fidelity Pro mode that might be some fun new ray tracing techniques, especially. We have so much more power in the ray tracing side of the GPU that we have some creative ideas there.
So I think there, the Insomniac engine has RT shadows, so perhaps we could see an implementation of RT shadows in this game, or maybe something pulled from a future title. If they did do RT shadows, I'd want them to probably improve that implementation a little bit relative to what we do see on PC. But like I said, I think that performance mode is probably going to be the way to go for most players. They also did mention kind of the Insomniac philosophy when it came to PS5 Pro. Basically as a tool to enhance image quality primarily for 60 FPS modes, but also he did kind of hint at more in the future, possibly on PS5 Pro.
I think for us, there's some historical factor to how we've built our PS5 games so far. We've really thought of them as fidelity first titles and then gotten them to work at 60. And so I think in these instances, we're looking at those games as an opportunity to get back the fidelity level, the image quality level we wanted, while still letting players play at 60. But I think in the future, it's a tier of hardware we get to think about and address differently and maybe come up with some fun new things to do, for sure.
So yeah, I did also look at Ratchet and Clank, which we can discuss now if you'd like. It's fairly similar to
sure, go ahead.
Yeah. So it's a little bit slower paced. So I got a really good feel for how PSSR looks in that title relative to Spider-Man, which is like super fast paced. You're barreling through that city at like, I don't know, 60 kilometers an hour, 40 kilometers an hour, or something crazy. The image looked very natural to me. That's how I would describe it. It looked very natural. It didn't have an excessive level of sharpness, but it was clearly resolving a lot of detail. Relative to the PS5 performance mode, which is running side by side here, it looked much, much, much better overall. The PS5 appeared very over-sharpened and kind of messy in close-ups in comparison, which is maybe not something you'd notice at a typical viewing distance from a 4K display. When you're looking at it up close, PSSR is just so much better. It's doing a really good job. I think Ratchet is maybe holding up a little bit better overall in terms of that image quality than Spider-Man, but I think that's probably a mix maybe of more forgiving game content in terms of that speed of traversal and in terms of the kind of stuff they're doing with scale, and a higher base resolution here, because I was able to count it out a few times. The number that was coming up for me most often was about 1440p. So that's a bit of a higher number than I saw in Spider-Man here. Relative to the fidelity mode, I think each is going to have its strengths and weaknesses, but they should look fairly similar overall, I think. One thing they did have for me was they had a little demo where they were showing the confetti in the opening parade. And when they used the analytical TA techniques, the IGTI technique they had before the Insomniac games, this temporal injection technique, it had a lot of trails and it had a lot of breakup in it.
Yep.
But with PSSR, it was resolving perfectly, very cleanly with coherent looking confetti. And I think some of these analytical TA techniques tend to fall apart when they're not presented with kind of all the inputs they like, whereas these machine learning based techniques are faring a lot better. And I think PSSR certainly was exemplary of that here. And if anything, speaking to Mike, he said that we're probably going to see some substantial improvements to PSSR in the future, and they have been seeing some improvements to PSSR just in their own experience working with it thus far as well.
We've had not just quality improvements, also performance improvements to it, which has been really nice. And yeah, over time, it's improved in areas of ghosting and detail and things like that. So I expect we'll see more of that going forward too.
Okay, that's really interesting because fundamentally, this is like for Sony's first attempt at doing machine learning based upscaling, and it's certainly not easy. Just ask Nvidia. They needed to do an entire second generation of DLSS in order to get it into shape, and since then we've seen like iterative improvements. So it's kind of good that we seem to be looking at already Sony getting close, or at least within the same sort of ballpark as second generation DLSS. And from there, we should start to see those iterative improvements. But, going back to those like particle effects, even some of the machine learning based scaling techniques struggle with that. Mm-hmm. So, to see PSSR actually doing a good job of it's pretty good stuff, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that totally, to me, I do see this as possibly a DLSS style progression where we see improvements to the model, where we see developers getting to grips with how best to integrate it into their games. Like you see with Insomniac, they're just cutting out a sharpening pass and all of a sudden it looks so much better because it doesn't really need the sharpening pass, right? So perhaps that's indicative of some things we might see from other developers in the future as well. Because I think one element of PSSR that is super impressive, and we'll talk about that with the next game here, is that it is capable and often does resolve more detail than native res TAA at 4K. It is really, really, really sharp and very, very, very detailed. So maybe you don't need that extra step of trying to bring out that edge enhancement. Maybe you don't really need that anymore, is kind of my impression. I also did ask him a little bit about PSSR. I asked some other developers this question as well, which is if it could be updated independent of title updates, i.e. by the system. And no one was able to talk about that or confirm that. So I'm kind of thinking maybe not at the moment. But that would be an interesting development. It would be very PC-like in that respect. That'd be interesting if Sony could pull it off. I'm not sure they can with the way that PS5 games work on the packaging side, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it would need a new package. I guess there's also the concern that there could actually be a regression in quality. Sometimes there is, right?
Yeah.
And if the developer has no oversight over the quality, if there is just like a drop-in replacement for PSSR, they're kind of like one step removed from the process and it could go wrong. But the concept of actually just naturally adding PSSR updates as you're progressing through updates for the game organically, I think that's probably a more likely scenario.